Hello, everyone, and welcome to AlphaStaffHCM's webinar series. Today's webinar, Employee Documentation, Best Practice in Compliance, is an hour long and will be presented by Yoladi Adkins, who I'm going to introduce shortly. Before we begin, I would like to provide a brief technical overview. As you may have noticed, all attendee phone lines are muted and will remain so throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please enter them via the Q&A feature as you think of them, or you can wait to add them at the end of the presentation when we open it up for questions. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing on alphastaffhcm.com under the Resources tab. Before we close out today's session, we will share a survey. We encourage you to take a moment to provide us with feedback on today's presentation. Attendance in today's live webinar is approved for 1 credit with both HRCI and SHRM. At the end of the presentation, I will share the contact information needed to request the credit codes. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenter. Yoladi Adkins has worked as an HR account manager at AlphaStaffHCM for over 2 years. With over 10 years of experience as an HR professional, Yoladi has gained strong operational and functional skills. Yoladi has experience in profit and nonprofit HR businesses and holds a master's degree in human resource management. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass it off to Yoladi.
Thank you, Charlene. Just wanted to welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Obviously, everyone knows that this session is going to be about documentation, but more importantly, it's about people, right? Fairness, protection for both the employees and the organization. So I did want to just set a few expectations just for the setting before I jump into the agenda. So the webinar is practical, right? You're going to walk away knowing how to document, when to document, and what to actually do while you're documenting, right? We're going to go ahead and also talk a little bit about real risks, legal, unemployment, morale, and essentially how good documentation is going to prevent those issues from ever arising. So as you see here on the agenda, first tab, we want people to succeed. The second one, purpose of creating good documentation, right? Again, minimizing that liability. Then we'll go into the risks resulting from poor documentation. So again, we'll speak a little bit about legal, unemployment, loss of morale and trust, so on and so forth. Okay, we want people to succeed. Okay, so we're going to kind of just dive right into a manager's role. We're going to talk a little bit about setting expectations, leading by example, providing oversight and review, support and training staff, anyone that, could potentially be assisting you or another manager in the documentation process, ensuring compliance and maintaining accountability. So the first point I kind of want to address is managers play a critical role in documentation, right? It's not just the HR department, Alpha staff, what have you. It's managers, business operations managers, of that sort. So making sure that any manager that you have, or if you are a manager, that you're setting the expectations very clearly, and making sure that they are set early, right? So you want to make sure that documentation is consistent, that it's timely. You want to make sure that that the documentation is supporting clarity, growth, and accountability, right? What does that mean? Essentially, you want to be clear on everything that you're doing in the sense of, discussing whether it be a good documentation, hey, you're doing a great job, or maybe corrective documentation. This will promote the growth, right, of, whoever it is you're speaking to, your staff, and ultimately you want to make sure that everyone is held accountable to their jobs. And again, leading by example also avoids that reliance on the muscle memory. And what that essentially means is you want to make sure that you're documenting very close to whatever instance happens, right? If there was a specific concern that needs to be addressed, doing it, way later in a week after it happens is probably not best case in that type of situation. So, within that 24 to 48 hours, will mitigate the memory gaps that you have on that specific, incident that happened. Providing oversight and review. So just regularly reviewing the documentation for accuracy and consistency. You want to make sure that what you're writing is not only legible but also understandable, because again, these documents that the documentation that we're essentially giving or having could potentially be used at a later time, right? Supporting and training your staff too to provide guidance, resources, and feedback, making sure that new staff and existing staff receive the proper training and documentation practices. So if you have like a new manager or somebody who's kind of maybe being promoted into that role, you want to make sure that they are armed with, the right type of training so that they're able to execute whenever documentation is necessary or needed. Ensuring compliance, so verifying that all the documents and all the documentation meets your internal policies. This, could even mean for audit reasons. So just making sure that you're kind of dotting your I's and crossing all T's in that aspect. Maintaining accountability. I know we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but just making sure that you're holding your team members responsible for the proper documentation, right? A lot of times we can get a little bit lazy, or kind of just not write out all the details. Again, we want to make sure that we're, at least thinking about what could potentially come of this specific instance. If nothing at all, great. But again, if there is a future, situation that arises, you want to make sure that you have that proper documentation. Okay, purpose of creating good documentation. So this essentially is asking, why must we make sure, right? Why should it be consistent? Why should it be specific and timely? Why should we have all of the facts, right? So one question that I would pose to ask yourself maybe is, what or would a third party, if someone else that had absolutely no idea what was going on in this specific, incident, instance, concern being reported, what have you, would a third party understand what happened and why it happened, right? And why I'm documenting? That's good because you want to make sure that you're providing enough information, the consistency, the specificity, the timeliness of everything, all of the events in the event that, hey, for instance, you're not there, someone else kind of comes in, whoever it is that's looking from like an external point of view is able to understand all of the intricate details of what took place because of your documentation, right? So consistency is key. The business must be able to demonstrate that employees are being treated fairly and consistently, right? So making sure that if you're going to be documenting, on one instance for one person and say their coworker months later have the same, if not, very similar type of incident or type of situation, you want to make sure that you're staying consistent so that, there's no favoritism, accusations, or, hey, you documented this about me, but so and so is doing that and you didn't have documentation on them, right? The specificity is key also. Having clear factual record is critical, making sure that, you're kind of addressing whatever situation you're dealing with, but then also being specific as to, a policy violation, right? The timeliness, again, we'll continue to say that throughout the presentation that, you need to make sure that you're recording all of this, all of whatever is happening within 24 to 48 hours, again, because you don't want to, forget certain things. You don't want to let so much time go by that, individuals didn't really expect maybe a write-up, but now they're getting one. Um, Being fact-based, again, including dates, times, examples, make sure that when and if you are doing this and you want to be extremely, fact-based, you're not really giving an emotional side of it, right? Like your opinion or placing any type of judgment, make it very matter of fact, and professional. The common mistakes sometimes that we see managers make, is, just having a little bit of vagueness, unclear statements, maybe not having enough examples, right? And just kind of saying, hey, this is just what I heard happened, or this is what I assumed happened. So making sure that you're able to kind of really decipher on, like I said, a policy that's being violated or things that you've actually witnessed. Adding personal attacks or subjective comments, right? We want to make sure that we're kind of, and even in, tensions raised situations, we want to make sure that we're kind of holding that professionalism and not inserting our opinions or our feelings on the matter and keeping it more or less just straight to the facts of what happened. So, yeah, you can go to the next one. Okay, so we're going to do a knowledge check, which is like a little poll. If you guys want to go ahead and just insert or click on what answer you believe is correct, the knowledge check question is, when should a manager document a performance concern? I'll give you about 30 seconds to go ahead and answer. Okay, so I don't know. Did we get the answers in? Got them. Okay. So it looks like everyone answered the right one, and that's as soon as the issue occurs. So very good. And obviously, again, I just kind of got done saying it, but making sure that we're remembering all of the facts, the details, if there's any witnesses, that we need to speak to, the sooner, the very better. Okay. So how to create reliable documentation, right? So we want to make sure that we're starting with the expectations, like I had mentioned. Um, Job descriptions always kind of go back to that, right? Each and every person should have at least a very, detailed understanding of what their job description is. They should also have a very good understanding of what the policies and the procedures are within either their department or within the entire company, right? So just making sure that you are always make sure that they're always aware, I guess, of what their responsibilities are and kind of how that coincides with the manager and the team as a whole. Make sure that you're describing behavior performance that must change, or on the flip side of that, behavior that you want to see continue, right? It's always really good to say to somebody, hey, I really like the way that you do this, or hey, I like, the fact that you're really diligent with, helping others, or whatever the example might be. So maybe starting with that could be helpful. But then also on the other side of it, making sure that you're, addressing the behavior that maybe needs to change or that you can help them, right? So describing the conduct, not so much the individual, right? But what's actually happening, avoid making broad judgments, keeping the observations job related. Again, not, putting our emotions into it, but making sure that we're talking just specifically about what we're seeing job related. And then describe how behavior impacts others too. That's a big one where you can kind of say, hey, this specific behavior, if for whatever reason it's, affecting others around the office or, within the organization, kind of describe how that can impact the team as a whole. Include the employee's explanation for expectations that aren't being met. So have that two-way conversation, right? Make sure that, when you're having this conversation, it's not just you kind of addressing them, but allow them to, kind of reiterate. Maybe you are going to find, new things out. You're going to, figure out that this person could potentially be going through maybe something personally that's kind of flowing into work, right? Be open to being that support person, obviously in the most professional way, but allowing them to explain their side and not really rushing to judgment because that can backfire on us. And then prepare a detailed action plan that the employee should be using to improve performance, right? So there's two different items here I kind of want to touch on. A PIP versus a coaching plan. So obviously, I think a lot of people probably know what PIPs are. Um, for instance, in the event that you don't think that it should be more corrective, but you think in the sense of coaching, right? PIPs are normally more corrective. Coaching is kind of more as a support, right? Like more supportive. So an example of this could just be a conversation to clarify the expectations and support improvement as opposed to having it be super disciplinary, right? A PIP would be more or less repeated performance issues. After we've had this coaching session, the issues are continuing, maybe getting worse, right? That's when we lead into that next step of having a PIP versus having that coaching, right? And then just be realistic, right? Focus on a few key areas. Don't expect the world to change in a day, but give those, realistic expectations. Okay. So just to continue on how to create reliable documentation. So setting deadlines, um, and making sure that you're holding, your staff to those deadlines with the specificity. Again, make sure that you're being very specific on what your expectations are. So an example could potentially be this report is due by 5 p.m. tomorrow, making sure that you're following up on said expectations and deadlines. Making sure also that you're keeping a written record of this, right? You can add any type of additional training. You can kind of just gauge just based on what's going on if any discipline, further discipline is needed. The more senior the employee is, the less hand holding they should receive, right? Obviously, that's give and take just depending on the situation. But again, you obviously should be expecting a little bit more from tenured employees than you would kind of somebody who just started a couple weeks ago. So then will lead to describing the consequences if the behavior performance, continues. So don't discuss the consequences in early coaching, right? Again, that time is more or less for support. You want to make sure that you're, leaving yourself available to support and really trying to fix the problem as opposed to kind of just saying, hey, you know what, we've decided that it's not going to work out. Repeated or serious violations, right? So again, if you see that the consequences of the behavior and the poor performance continue, you have to really kind of address and say, hey, if we don't see a change, this specific situation or this specific thing that you're either not doing or not performing at, could end up leading, to termination. So we're trying to give you the benefit of the doubt and work with you. And make sure that when you're describing or when you're documenting all of this, describe all of these conversations in detail. Everything that was said, everything that happened, even if you need to write the person's name, so and so had said, and then write verbatim what they said, just so again, when you or whomever, reads that documentation, they're able to kind of really understand how the flow of the conversation went. Again, we'll go back into this, avoiding using vague phrases that could be grounds futuristically for a discrimination law. So culture fit, bad attitude, wasn't feeling the vibes, right? Like all of those words that I think we hear secularly. It can backfire. So again, trying to remove emotions out of this is going to be huge, and just make sure that your documentation is, factual. And then preparing documentation with the expectation, again, that a third party or somebody external will read it, making sure that you're including enough information so that others know what happened. And again, I kind of just want to reiterate that if you kind of think before you go into any documentation that if there was another person who had absolutely no idea what was going on, would come in, would they be able to understand every kind of detail of the situation or incident? Okay. Which situation, so sorry, we're going to do another knowledge check, another poll. So which situation do you think requires documentation the most? I'll give you all another 30 seconds to answer. Okay, so the majority of you answered it correctly. It's all of the above, right? So when in doubt, document is kind of what I like to go off of. Performance reviews, very important. Attendance issues, obviously very important. Behavior, conduct concerns, very important. They're all essentially really important reasons as to why you should document. So again, it could be the smallest or the biggest thing. Just make sure that if you're questioning whether or not you should document it, then you probably should. Okay. All right, so how to create reliable documentation continued. So these are the places essentially that would be the most critical. Performance reviews, performance issues, attendance and timekeeping, and then behavioral and conduct concerns. So performance reviews could be, support ratings, feedback that you're giving, developmental decisions, things of that nature. Really just make sure that you're ensuring evaluations are fair, that they're consistent, and that you're able to defend as to why you've, provided this person with this type of performance review. You want to make sure that you are documenting the performance issues, right? So the specific concerns, any coaching that's been provided, any expectations that you want to see moving forward. And then again, establish a clear history of the feedback and opportunities to improve so that everybody's on the same page. Attendance and timekeeping. So make sure that you're tracking patterns and especially any policy violations, right? That policy or that handbook is really going to be key in your documentation to addressing situations where you feel like the policies have been violated. Here's the example. This is the page that you can find the policy on in the handbook, and then corrective actions, right? We want to make sure that we're setting a precedent not just to one person but to all staff across the board that attendance is really important. So support consistency and compliance with wage and hour requirements as well. Behavioral and conduct concerns. So anything that you would deem as inappropriate or unprofessional, objectively would be something that you need to document. And again, a lot of times it may just be someone's having a bad day or they're having a bad week, or like I said, something personal is happening and it's kind of flowing into work. But better safe than sorry, especially with the behavioral piece. You want to make sure that any and all of that is documented, because if something again were to arise later on in the future, you want to be sure that you have that information on that first occurrence. Okay. So best practices, right? How to best document. So again, be very timely, be factual and objective, focus on the observable behaviors and the outcomes, right? Avoid again opinions, assumptions, or any type of emotional language that could potentially be viewed as discriminatory. Be specific, including the best dates, the examples, the impact on the work, the team, even on the person, right? You can even go as far as saying, we care for you as an employee. We want to make sure that we're doing our best to support you as an employee, but be very specific on how you view, the situation kind of either affecting the team or the individual and their work and their responsibilities. Clearly state the expectations. They have to know what to do right. And by that, they have to know what they're currently doing wrong, right? Being consistent, documenting all conversations. So if you need to record the coaching discussions, and by record, I don't necessarily mean on video. I just mean, documenting the coaching discussions, any of the feedback given, and even, allow the opportunity of the employee to respond to that coaching. Good, bad, or indifferent, they should be allowed to kind of have that, talk back, that two-way conversation. Clearly note the expectations, improvement plans, and the follow-up timelines. Make sure that you're outlining the next step so that everybody, again, is clear on the expectations. And in the event that the expectations are not met, then, no one can say, hey, you didn't let me know, or hey, I didn't understand, right? And then maintain your professional records, right? So accurate, complete, make sure that all of the documentation is stored appropriately, whether that be in someone's, electronic file, whether you have, just a cloud. I don't know how everyone uses their documentations, but just make sure that you're able, whenever you need to access that information, if you need to, that you're able to. Okay, risks resulting from poor documentation. Okay, so the legal risks. I'll just kind of go through just the numbers, and then we'll talk a little bit about each. So wrongful termination claims, discrimination and harassment investigations, wage and hour violations, unemployment and workers' comp disputes, regulatory exposure, audit exposure, inconsistencies, right, with enforcement claims, and essentially just loss of credibility as a whole. So the wrongful terminations claims, so without any clear documentation, it's really hard to legitimize, the reason for termination or the reason for discipline. So a lot of times, you'll see employers losing disputes, even when what the decision that they made was, valid. They may lose because the documentation wasn't appropriate. So the discrimination and harassment claims, right? Lack of documentation in this area can really make actions seem or appear very inconsistent or biased. So you don't ever want kind of that rapport. You don't want that reputation of being inconsistent, biased, or showing any type of favoritism. So just make sure that you're kind of thinking about that when you are, documenting. Weak records undermining the employer's defense in an EEOC investigation, that can be really big too. So again, just think of how these things can become, litigation later on and focus primarily, like I said, on, the facts when you're doing the documents because of this, because these documents may end up in the hands of attorneys, right? So just kind of make sure that you're thinking about that. Wage and hour violations, so missing or inaccurate pay time, these things can essentially lead to back pay or penalties or fines, right? So just making sure that you're, appropriate in all of your documentation when it comes to, paying people or time punches and all of that. Unemployment and workers' compensation disputes. So poor documentation makes it really hard to challenge these unemployment claims. So just be sure that, again, everything is, detailed. All of the questions that you're, asking have all of the correct and factual information so that in the event if it turns into an unemployment case, we can make sure that, we're going into that dispute with, all of the right information to help you win that claim. It can also result in higher insurance costs and unfavorable rulings. So again, just keeping all of this in mind. Regulatory and audit exposure. So inadequate records can violate federal, state, or local laws. So just make sure that, again, you're kind of thinking about all of these things. You don't want to either be the cause or the reason that, something can result in a fine or a penalty for your company. Um, Inconsistent enforcement claims. So when similar issues are handled differently without documentation, employees risk claims of unfair and unequal treatment, right? So again, just kind of thinking about the reputation of the company and all of that. You just want to make sure that everything is, legitimate as it should be when you're making these types of written claims, or I'm sorry, written documentations. And then loss of credibility. So again, in legal proceedings, undocumented and poorly documented decisions carry, less weight. And you don't want to, kind of be in a situation where you have a couple of different employees that are, litigating against you. And then it's kind of the same thing over and over again, right? You're fighting the same type of situation and or claim against you. And then you're coming in a couple of different times with, poor documentation. Essentially what we, kind of want to make sure that you're left with is, if it's not documented, then it didn't happen. So making sure that you're really, really focusing on strong documentation because of the legal risks as a whole that come from not. Okay, one more knowledge check. So I'll go ahead and read it. Which of the following is the most important reason to document performance issues? I'll go ahead and give you 30 seconds. Very good. Everyone got it right? So to document the process for compliance and protection, right? Again, I know I've said it a few different times, but the compliance and protection piece on both ends, right? Not just for the employer, but also for the employee, and just making sure that, you have a lot of trust and morale, not only with that specific situation, but, we have eyes watching us and in the sense of other people, within the organization. And even if, an individual is not directly connected with a situation, right? They're always looking and seeing, how is the organization going to handle this specific situation? And that situation may set a precedent with other staff. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, so the unemployment risks. So essentially, in a nutshell, the employer bears the burden of proof, right? So the documentation that you establish will provide that consistency and fairness, right? The employee violated a known company policy. There was a pattern of violations and an accompanying pattern of warnings, right? Making sure that you have those warnings stacked up too, so that you can't ever be told like, hey, I didn't know that this was, an issue, and just making sure that you're being consistent, right? Um, any other employee would face the same consequences for the same violation. So I know I spoke a little bit about this, just making sure that you're staying consistent with how you're treating one individual or one situation. Make sure that if that specific thing comes up with maybe a really good employee 6 months later, that you're handling it the same. Um, and then in addition to other best practices listed here, get statements, right, from other firsthand witnesses, people that could potentially be, kind of in the same room or in the same area. They may have witnessed something, right? And maybe a lot of times you'll see that people don't want to kind of, insert themselves. But if you have people that are, more than willing and totally fine, kind of giving their perspective on the situation, definitely welcome that. Cite violations of relevant policies and apply behavior to that policy violation. So again, going back to that handbook, and one thing I definitely want to emphasize is making sure that you're able to clearly articulate which policy has been in violation. So going back to the handbook, and this may, kind of prompt some of you to look at your handbook again and make sure that you're able to kind of really dig in and look at the handbook and say, okay, this would be a good, policy to add to this specific violation, so that again, you're not kind of just going off of, hey, I've just seen this person's performance. You're able to kind of really factually check and say, hey, this is the policy that you signed off on when you first got hired, that you said you would honor, that we're seeing you kind of lack in. And then in an investigation, provide space for the employee comments, signatures, and statements. That signing does not signal an agreement, right? So in the event that an individual decides to sign, that doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with everything that's written. And sometimes you'll have employees that want to write their own, kind of documentation of what happened, right? Allow that, because it is good to see that, you're allowing other people to kind of have a weigh in on, a documentation or a write up that maybe left them to feeling like they weren't heard. So, and make sure that all of that is collected and kept. So again, if this were to turn into something later on that we would need to see both sides, we're able to present that. Okay, loss of morale and trust. So employees will feel blindsided without documentation, right? In the event that you decide to kind of bypass a few different instances of poor performance, and then all of a sudden, you're kind of coming to someone with a final written warning, that may be something that they see as a blind side. You have to kind of let people know where they're at, especially when it comes to their job, especially if there's, things that need to, improve. In order for them to improve, they have to know what they're doing wrong, right? So just make sure that with the documentation, if if someone's asking you, why am I getting written up for this, or why, if it's, a verbal, why is it being documented? Just make sure that you're, very candid with them and letting them know, just so that we have a record of conversation, so that later on there's no blind side in the event that we have to kind of circle back to this specific situation. Conversations become personal instead of factual. So again, want to just reiterate that, making sure that you're not necessarily using, language that may describe more feelings as opposed to the factual information, or the facts that happened in that situation. Um, Leave out of it your feelings, or how maybe even others are feeling, and more of an awareness on, what is happening and how it is affecting the job, and the team. Performance improvement becomes harder without clear history. So if there is such a problem, why is this the first time I'm hearing that, right? I'm sure a lot of us have heard that before. So again, you have to give that person an opportunity to know right at the very beginning that you're kind of, hey, high alert, there's a little bit of an issue going on, or hey, high alert, I'm taking a little bit of notice here in this area. Let's try to nip it in the butt right when we find out, as opposed to kind of waiting for that to kind of grow, and then you're left with kind of having to answer the question, well, this is the first time that I'm hearing about this. You want to make sure that the very first time that you witness it, or the very first time that it's brought to your attention, that that's the first time, that it's discussed. And then again, it avoids that last minute memory gap. So making sure that, you're not waiting super long to have the conversations, because a lot of things can happen between the first time and that final time. You may not remember everything really well, and that's going to, downwardly affect your documentation. So to be really fact driven and correct in all of the things that you're saying and the things that have taken place and happened. Just make sure that you're documenting quickly, or that you're addressing every issue or anything performance wise right when it happens. More difficult to support. So documentation will obviously be a little bit more difficult to support without documentation. So HR can't defend actions without facts, right? So, a manager may call and say, hey, I've had this issue with, this individual, this specific instance happened like 6 months ago. The first thing your HR department is going to ask, do you have any write-ups, right? What was the first date, right? What actually happened? And is this more or less hearsay, or did you witness this, right? There's going to be questions to the managers that are going to come, right? So as a manager, you want to make sure that you have those answers and that you have all of those things recorded, so that you're giving HR all of the information that they need, right, to help guide you into that next step. Because they're not going to be able to support you without documentation. They're not going to be able to support you without knowing exactly what happened. And I mean, again, if things have been documented for the last 6 months to a year, you may not be able to remember every instance or every conversation or every single thing that happened. So the documentation not only supports you in kind of remembering, but also helps, HR guide you in the way that you need to go. Leadership can't assess patterns or risks, right? So if this were to be escalated to leadership, they need to be able to come, back to you with that guidance, knowing all of the patterns or the risks that, could potentially come from, say it be, a termination, or say it be a final written warning. In order for them to do their job, they need to kind of have all of the facts. So again, I would say, over document, and even, give yourself just maybe a spreadsheet of specific dates or occurrences, whatever works, whatever your policy is, whatever that looks like for your specific organization. Over document, so that you can never kind of have that gray area of left out information, or I'm not really sure if it was Thursday or Friday, right? Um, and then without documentation, terminations, promotions, and transfers become subjective. So if there's an individual that, has had previous documentation for, having just bad behavior, right? And then they're like, hey, I really want to transfer to this other location or to this job, right? You're not going to be able to give that new manager or that new location an accurate assessment of this individual, their performance, their conduct without documentation, right? And again, you want to make sure that you're not just documenting the poor behavior or the poor performance, but if you have a really good employee, you want to make sure that you're documenting the good stuff too, right? Like this person has, gotten, I don't know, employee of the month, X amount of months throughout this year, or when you're having those conversations in the coaching aspect, right before, you go into the PIP, you want to make sure that, hey, had coaching on, January 15th with this individual and saw an immediate change 1 week later. Still going to work on XYZ, but just making sure that in that documentation or in that coaching, or if it leads to that PIP, that you are addressing both the good and the bad. Okay, we're already to our takeaways. So, takeaways, why does it matter? Why does this matter? I mean, it's super simple. It protects you and the organization. I think we had mentioned that at the very beginning. It ensures clarity, accountability, and compliance, supports fair evaluations and decision making. So, again, when it comes to someone being promoted, you want to be able to say and have documented really good things. And if you want to maybe kind of be a little bit more resistant on, having that person, transfer to a different department or get that promotion, you want to be able to make sure that you're giving that fair evaluation and you're not essentially giving someone else, I air quotes, a problem, right? So it matters on both ends of the spectrum, the good and the bad. What is expected? So document work accurately, honestly, and on time. To use approved tools, templates, and systems, right? So, things that you're going to be, or tools and systems that are going to be able to house these documents, and you're able to, kind of make sure that no matter who it is in management that needs to see them, that they have access to it. Again, always thinking to yourself, if there was a third party or another person that was reading this, are they going to be able to understand how I've articulated this or how I've written this? And then keeping records clear, factual, and professional. Cannot emphasize enough on keeping your feelings out of it. A lot of times, us as managers, we have already kind of just a notion, or we've already kind of decided and established that, X amount of instances, 5 times this individual, we already have that preconceived notion that this is probably just going to end up not working out. But you don't want to ever put that into documentation. You don't ever want to kind of assess an individual off of your emotions. Always keep it very matter of fact, even if you don't believe or see the moral fit right. You always have to keep it very matter of fact in how they're breaking a policy violation as opposed to what you don't like about them or how you think they can do better personally. um, Best practices. So record key actions, decisions, and outcomes, especially the outcome piece. For example, you may document or you may have someone come in for, poor performance and they just need a little bit more training, right? So obviously you write that out in a documentation. Hey, this is a warning or a first verbal written warning on training, right? We have to spend more time with training or in training, whether that be video training or hands-on training, right? With that, then you want to come back with the outcome of, hey, this individual spent X amount of hours a week and they did and completed all of the training. Next week, we're going to start hands-on training and always just give the outcome, right? What did you do to get that person to that place, right? Because again, if this were to ever come, later on in the future, anybody would come and say, well, I never got training. You're able to document not only that they received training, but that they excelled in it or that they received, both video and hands-on training. So again, over documenting, I'm just using a little bit of an example with the training piece, but the actions taken, the decisions made, and the outcomes. Include the dates, names, and relevant details. Update documentation regularly, not after the fact. So again, it should be like an active document or a live document. You shouldn't be going back to revisit it, a weeks or two later. Just make sure that, whatever happens, even if it's on a day-to-day basis, that you're consistently documenting that and, using the dates to kind of be able to tell what happened on which date. And then remember, if it isn't documented, then it cannot be verified. So even if you think of something and you're like, oh, that happened and I forgot to document it, it could be as simple as opening up a Word document, putting all of the information in there, and then translating that information to, the forms that y'all use for documentation. But just make sure that you're writing things down so that you don't forget, because we all have a lot of things going on, and it's really easy for us to kind of just forget about specific details that may make or break a case in the future. And then when in doubt, just ask for guidance. There's a lot of people, obviously, at AlphaStaff that are more than willing to help in the sense of, how do I document, or is this worthy of a documentation, or anything like that. But also, with your HR departments, you always want to make sure that before you're having any conversation with an employee or anytime you're writing anything in an email, I would totally guide you and support you in kind of running this draft of an email past or this draft of a documentation past someone in HR so that they can kind of deter you if you are getting a little bit emotional. You are using, words that maybe shouldn't be included in documentation, instead of kind of just getting upset or wanting to kind of just fire off an email. Make sure that you're protecting yourself, the company, and the employee before you're sending things off, especially in writing, by just asking for a little bit of guidance from HR. Okay, I think that's it. We're back to the Q&A. Well, I appreciate everybody that came on for this webinar. I think we're going to take some questions, so I'll go ahead and give it back to you, Charlene.
Thank you, Yoladi. Great information. At this time, we want to invite your questions. As a reminder, you will remain muted, so please use the Q&A feature. One question came in. What language should be avoided in documentation?
Okay. So just, like I had mentioned, the emotional or judgmental language, I'm trying to think, anything that can sound like an opinion or kind of like a feeling or a personal assessment on an individual, or like if you were to say like, well, this person's just super rude, or Well, that's a lie. Because those are kind of, you are at that point not so much listening and addressing an issue, you're more or less inserting your opinion on how this individual acts, right? So always being able to say, hey, this is the policy that you're violating, or like the conduct in this office is different than kind of what I'm witnessing, but using words that could potentially be insulting, lazy, lying, rude, bad attitude, those are kind of erring on the side of, okay, is this a policy violation, or is this just how you feel about me? Essentially, if it can't be tied or proven in a policy, if it can't be tied to a policy, just don't write it, because that's, just being safer than sorry later.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mhm.
Should the documentation be always in English or in the language the employee speaks slash understand?
Okay, that's a really good question. So I think in this specific case, obviously you want to make sure that the individual who's receiving the documentation understands the documentation. So I think in both, right? And thank God for technology, we have translation now. I think it's like just so easy to just type it in, and kind of get a translation. But my opinion on the matter would be yes. You want to make sure that if for whatever reason the individual is Spanish speaking or Haitian speaking, that they're able to understand fully what's expected of them, right? Because if not, then obviously they're not going to be able to execute. But I do believe I don't think it should just be one language. I think, at that point it has to be in both, so that whoever, like I said, a third party that comes in, or if it's litigated later, whoever has their hands on it is able to fully understand the details of the documentation. But definitely, if the individual is Spanish speaking, Haitian speaking, or Creole, I'm sorry, speaking, then I think that it definitely needs to match that so that there's clear expectations on both ends.
A follow-up question to the previous question. In that case, both original and translated documentation should be signed, or just one is enough?
Say it again.
In that case, both original and translated documentation should be signed, or should just one is
Yes.
enough?
Yeah, I think one is enough. I don't necessarily think, again, I think having somebody sign something that they're not able to read, right, or understand legibly, is wouldn't matter. I think as long as one is signed, the one that they're interpreting exactly what's expecting of them is fine.
You? Where can I get employee documentation templates?
So I think there are, there's helpful resources online. I don't want to push anyone to online though, because I know that there's an expectation to have like especially depending on the states, that are kind of across the board here. But there are resources that we can probably help with, if there needs to be a documentation form created. I don't know that we have any kind of just on hand to give out, but that's something that we can follow up on. And whoever had written that question will follow up maybe directly with them to see what types of forms. I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a ton of different forms. Is it more or less, I guess, is the question more or less like verbals, written warnings? Is it kind of just encompassing all forms?
I would
Wondering.
say maybe encompassing all. If
Okay.
they were to document a specific incident, where
Mhm.
can they get a template?
A form. Yeah,
Mm.
let's kind of revisit that. I don't know offhand like where they're, specific ones that again, I think they're, easily creatable. I think they're editable on different places, but again, I think it needs to kind of be more specific as to, okay, what do you want, the document to read? How, I mean, we can edit, all of the documents to say or ask specific questions, but I don't know that there's going to be a specific template that I can actually say, like, go to this website and get this one. So maybe we can kind of just follow up after that, and we can kind of see a little bit more as to where we can guide.
I would say also reach out to your HR account managers.
Yeah.
They'll ask all the questions and they'll be able to help, you
Yeah,
know,
definitely.
create
Yeah.
something specifically for your company.
Yeah, I think yeah, and especially industry specific too.
Mhm.
Those are kind of things where I don't want to necessarily necessarily say, here's the perfect template. It's more or less creating one that fits
Mhm.
your organization and kind of the model of organization that you have.
Thank you. It was a great question.
Mhm.
How soon after an incident or achievement should documentation be completed?
So 24 to 48 hours, I would say is probably that's real sweet spot in terms of documentation. And again, I know, we all get really busy, and the last thing we want to do is kind of revisit an issue that happens at the office. But again, it's more or less kind of in that protection piece. Again, you want to make sure that you have all of the details, because if you were to wait any longer than a couple of days, it would kind of more or less ruin a little bit of what you're documenting, because that it can be arguable at that point. If you're doing it a week later, that individual may come back and say, well, no, that's not what happened, right? So just making sure that you have all of the details and that everything that you're writing can fully support a decision that you're going to make, and that you can feel confident in that conversation and having that difficult conversation with the employee or with HR, the sooner the better. So I would say 24 to 48 hours max.
Thank you. Another question came in. What is the difference between a PIP and a coaching plan?
So the PIP is more corrective. I'll keep it kind of simple. The PIP is more corrective. The coaching plan is more supportive, right? So PIPs are usually kind of, hey, we've already had conversations about this. We're going to push you on a performance improvement plan. We don't see, and on this performance improvement plan, we're going to need to see that you are, meeting the expectations by X date. And if not, then it could potentially lead to termination. So that type of conversation is going to be a little bit more down, more sour, more, hey, we're kind of on our last limb here with you. And not so much with you, but with your performance or with your behavior. I would say that a coaching, think of literal, what does a coach do, right? In sports, they help, right? They try to assist. Hey, what can I do to make things easier? Is there, something that I'm not doing as your manager? Is there more training that needs to be provided? Do you want to have like a buddy or a shadow buddy that you're able to, if it's a new employee, you don't really want to go straight to a PIP with somebody who just started. Obviously, you want to give them time to prove themselves, and it can be overwhelming depending on the industry that you're in. So just making sure that you're offering that opportunity for someone to get a little bit of coaching, a little bit more training, and that open, kind of dialogue to let you know that, hey, I'm really having a tough time with this, but in this specific area, giving them an opportunity to improve, or for you to support their improvement. I would say the PIP is, again, it's almost it comes after the coaching. It would be more like performance deficiencies, right? Performance issues that are repetitive. They keep happening, right? We've been down this road before. Now I have to put you on a PIP. So I would say that the coaching piece would come before it. And if in the event that the coaching piece doesn't work, then you have to go to that PIP.
Thank you for that, Yoladi. And we have time for one last question. Is documentation only for disciplinary issues, or should positive performance be documented too?
Yeah, so definitely document both, right? We want to create a balance of documentation. We don't want to just document the bad stuff, right? We definitely want to call attention to the things that have been documented that have shown improvement. You definitely want to have that kind of just historical, or the history of, where a person maybe started and how they've excelled. And we've heard of so many stories like that, where people kind of at first were really not getting it, and then they ended up getting tons of promotion to years down the line. So you want to have a good balance. You don't want to just document the bad. Being called into your office doesn't necessarily always have to be a bad thing, and making sure that you are really addressing and calling out the good too can help with morale, especially with somebody that maybe just might be having, a bad quarter, or if somebody may just be having a bad couple of weeks. A lot of times, things just are happening that kind of are, deeper than surface level. So making sure that, you have the record of also giving someone accolades and rewarding them, and making sure that they know that you're happy with their performance. You don't want to kind of just have this rapport of, yeah, well, this person's super negative, and the only time we ever really hear from them is when we're doing something wrong. So keeping that balance is really good.
Thank you, Yoladi. That's the last question.
Great.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
To request a copy of today's presentation, as well as the HRCI and SHRM credit codes, please send an email to webinars@alphastaff.com. All right. Stay tuned for our next webinar, Legal Updates for Employers, being presented by our partners at EagleTree Deacons on February 12th, 2026. And as a final reminder, a survey will pop up after the webinar ends. Please take a few moments to provide us feedback on today's webinar. Thank you, Yoladi, and thank you everyone for joining us and for your time. I hope you have an excellent rest of your day.